Hello, welcome to my channel. If you're returning, welcome back to my channel. I'm John Peters, and I'm a therapist who's been in practice for over 25 years, working with thousands of patients. And this channel is to share wellness tips and techniques to help you be less stressed, less anxious, and have more positive emotion in your life. And in this video, I am going to share some thoughts on meta stress and meta emotions. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk about meta stress and meta emotions. You've heard the word meta thrown around in different ways, but not sure if you've ever heard discussion of meta stress or meta emotions. So let me define those here at the beginning. Meta stress is when you have a primary stress trigger and then you have a secondary stress reaction on top of the primary one. All right. And this is illustrated well in an ancient Buddhist parable that goes like this. A warrior is on the battlefield and gets shot with an arrow and immediately reacts by pulling out their own bow and shooting themselves in exactly the same spot with a second arrow, right? So this might ring true in terms of reactions that you've had or seen others have, but we'll talk a little bit more about how that actually translates into how we react to stressors, right? Meta emotions are similar and where we have an emotional response, and then we have an emotional response about that first emotional response. So it's like getting angry, but then getting angry at yourself for being angry. So the second part of that is meta emotions. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. So meta stress is an actual thing, right? And because we see this discussion of it in the ancient parable, we know that people practicing meditation and studying the mind thousands of years ago actually had identified this phenomenon. And in more recent times, psychologists in the West have actually confirmed that and found the part of the brain that is responsible for causing meta stress to happen. So you don't need to know this for the quiz, but I will tell you that the part of the brain structure is called the anterior cingulate cortex. So if you take the gray squiggly part of a human brain and you lift it up so that you're looking up at the underneath side, so not the amygdala and all the glands in the endocrine system, but you're still looking at the neocortex, but from below, there's this symmetrical restructure across the full bottom arc of the bottom curve of the neocortex of the brain, and that's the cingulate cortex. So the front part, the anterior cingulate cortex, is where this activity happens that we could call shooting the second arrow. And it's also, interestingly, it's the part of the brain that is the mental glue that glues us into a stress target. And I talked about this in another video when I was talking about the logic of why it's good to meditate, because meditation actually changes the anterior cingulate cortex so that it performs better for us. And one of the ways that meditation changes the cingulate cortex is that it makes that glue not as strong so that we have more fluid attention and we don't get as stuck perseverating and worrying and fretting about a stress target beyond the point where it's constructive focus. So it's the same part of the brain that also causes the shooting the second arrow response. And interestingly, there is some recent cognitive neuroscience research that's looked at the shooting the second arrow type of phenomenon that's consistent with what the ancient meditators had found and written about, which is that people who meditate regularly do a little less of the shooting the second arrow, right? So, like if I'm going through the house in the middle of the night and I don't turn the lights on, I'm going to the kitchen to get a drink of water or something, and I run into the coffee table and hurt my shin, I have that immediate stress reaction of the surprise and shock and the pain of running into the furniture. That's the primary stress, but I might immediately start going, who put this effing coffee table here? That secondary response is the shooting the second arrow, right? Now, this is related to a more fundamental part of Buddhist psychology, which basically says most misery, if not all misery in human experience, is some version of shooting the second arrow, that we co-create a reality in the way that we perceive things and the way we relate to things, so that all misery is in the mind. And we can come back to that later and talk about whether that is fundamentally true in a more pure sense. But certainly in the sense of our daily activities, where each day we have a wide variety of triggers that trigger us as a primary stressor. Once you start thinking about it the way I'm describing it in this video, you will start to notice, oh yeah, there's me shooting my second arrow. So I think that there are two ways to approach improving that. And by improving, I mean doing less of it in a destructive way. And one is intellectual, which is, as I mentioned, if you notice it, then you can get in the habit of catching yourself when you're shooting the second arrow, parse that out as a separate reaction, and steer more into the fundamental reaction, how you're dealing with the primary situation, and steer out of taking the ball and running with it psychologically in terms of shooting the second arrow. Because if you start watching what the second arrow looks like in the quality of mind and what goes on in your head and in your reactions, it's typically a very negative reaction, and it spirals. If it's pointed inward, it spirals toward a destructive type of self-criticism and self-loathing. If it's outward, it's meanness and hate, and neither one of those types of reactions steer us toward a more constructive end, depending on what we need to do in any given moment. And they also don't steer us toward a more constructive way of being in the world, right? If self-loathing or hatred, right, are not conducive to satisfaction and happiness, morality aside, that's the way it works, right? Psychologically, you're full of meanness and hate toward yourself or others, you are not going to be okay with yourself or the world. That's the way it works. So on the practical level, noticing, okay, there's the second arrow. I'm going to steer out of that, because that's usually the point where we've gone from constructive focus into destructive extra misery. That's just adding on misery, but it's not adding something helpful. But the indirect way, again, I've said this in other videos, and I will say this again, because I firmly believe it through my own over 3 decades of practice with myself, and almost 3 decades of teaching others these practices. It turns out that if you do mindful breathing, and I've described that, in a video, that how to practice, I'll stick a link up above here. It turns out that people who do mindful breathing actually have changes in their brain structure and change the anterior cingulate cortex so that it performs differently when triggered with stress. And as I said, one way it changes is that mental glue that glues us into destructive worrying and fretting. It weakens that, but it also weakens the shooting the second arrow. And there's some recent cognitive neuroscience research that's actually looked at. They've done functional MRI studies where people who regularly meditate, a radiologist can actually see the difference on the brain scans in the functional MRIs of the meditators versus the non-meditators. It literally rewires the neural pathways in your brain, including in the anterior cingulate cortex. So mindful breathing is a really good, gentle, but powerful way to rewire your brain so that you do less of these types of things that destabilize you and make you miserable, and are able to be stable and have equanimity and acceptance and engagement toward being happier and less stressed, right? So let me talk a minute about meta emotions. Meta emotions are kind of the same thing, where we have a primary emotion and we have a secondary emotion on top of it. And so, again, for example, I could get angry about some situation and then get angry that I'm angry, right? And so, I think there are multiple angles to approach this when it's a challenging emotion. But I'll tell you my opinion. When asked, should we not have meta emotions? We don't have an off button. I think if we do meditation the way I described, we can have more constructive emotional responses and less destructive emotional responses. But there's no real off button for meta emotions. And honestly, I think we should just enjoy them when they're enjoyable, but play less with them when they're not. So if I get angry and then I get angry that I'm angry, once I notice that I'm doing the secondary thing, the meta emotion, and it's a negative one, 99% of the time it's going to be destructive and not constructive. It's rarely constructive. And one way to think about here's a measure for when challenging emotions are constructive versus destructive, and we should unhook from them. And I'm going to come back to this in another video where I talk about like working with shame and guilt and challenging emotions. But challenging emotions are constructive if they help us be in the world in the way that we want to be in the world, and they help us toward our goals. So I'll give you an example of that. If I feel bad and a negative emotion, let's say shame, because I flaked out on an agreement that I had with a friend, like to help them with something, like a project that they asked me to help with, and I agreed to help with, and then I feel shame because I flaked out on following through with the agreement. That is a constructive, challenging emotion because that shame can help shape me going forward in the future to be more likely to behave in a way that's consistent with my values of being trustworthy with my agreements, for example, and toward my goals of being a good friend, let's say. So that's a constructive, challenging emotion. But we often will have challenging emotions that are not constructive, even destructive. And if you look at your meta emotions when they are challenging emotions, so when they're so-called negative emotions, shame, guilt, sadness, anger, things like that, things that we don't enjoy when in the moment where we're experiencing them, 99% of the time, meta emotions are not constructive, which is why most of the time you can just let go of them. But I do say if you have a meta emotion that is positive, so let's say I'm happy that the sun is shining and the weather's nice and I'm taking this walk, and then I'm happy that I'm happy, right? I'm like, I'm really happy with myself that I'm able to be present and be open to this enjoyment, right? So I'm happy about the sunshine, and then I'm happy that I'm able to be happy about the sunshine. We could call that a positive meta emotion. Keep that one, right? We don't want to reject those. If you're going to pile on positivity onto positivity, as long as you're not frankly manic, right? Go with it. Take that ball and run with it, because all of us want more positive emotion in our lives as a slice of our pie of positive, neutral, and miserable. And so yeah, if you have meta emotions and they're positive, then keep them. So anyway, I wanted to share that meta stress and meta emotions, things to watch for, things to steer into and out of per my recommendations. And if you want a way to indirectly, positively influence all of that, again, the best way to do that is, find stability, dial down the chaos in your life, and do some regular daily soothing, mindful practice. For me, the best recommendation for that is mindful breathing, because you get the most bang for your buck in terms of the small amount of input of time and energy and the best return. There are other methods, but that's one I like to share simply because it's so easy to learn, so easy to practice, and takes very little time to get a good benefit. So thanks for joining me today. Feel very free to leave comments below, because I'd love to get feedback about how viewers are experiencing this channel. If you like this content, hit the like button below and feel very free to subscribe. I'll see you in a future video.